this is from last October. My son was traveling to Japan, and I had the opportunity to travel with him. I persuaded him to do a detour to their northernmost island of Hokkaido, largely because of my interest in seeing the vegetation in the part of Japan with a latitude and climate similar to ours. Although being able to get a tasting tour of the Sapporo brewery helped make my argument. We ended up spending 3 days in total. My experience of the countryside was limited to a day-long bus tour and what we could see from the train windows coming and going. Since I could not find any English floras of Japan, either as books or even online, all of my identifications are based first on the iNaturalist Artificial Intelligence ID, then research I did in iNaturalist of identifications of similar plants nearby to try to confirm them. And many of them have since been confirmed or corrected in iNat since my posting. I was curious that several of the most invasive species in North America originally came from northern Japan and nearby Russia. Plants like Japanese and Sakhalin knotweed, kudzu vine, common reed, Chinese silvergrass, and the temperate bamboos all naturally live in this area. I was curious to see what similarities the native vegetation might have with ours while evolving separately in their own ecosystems. The island of Hokkaido is 50% larger than Nova Scotia in total land area. It is also much more mountainous. The northernmost tip of the island is about the same latitude as Antigonish. It is on the eastern side of a large ocean with a similar cold current coming down the east coast as Nova Scotia. This first photo was taken on the main island of Honshu shortly before the bullet train entered the tunnel to Hokkaido. It is the second longest railway tunnel in the world, and with the train traveling at 160 kilometers an hour, it took 20 minutes before we came out the other side. There at Hakodate, we had to change trains for Sapporo. This is what I saw at the station. On the platform, I was surprised to see a familiar plant growing by the rails, the green-headed or cut-leaf coneflower. It was the first I saw of many introduced North American plants that can be found throughout Japan. As we left the station, it was obvious that Hokkaido had a noticeably different vegetation and a greater openness than the rest of Japan. In fact, its flora has much more in common with the neighboring Russian island of Sakhalin. The plant in the foreground is Japanese knotweed. And this is the common reed, Phragmites australis, that invades our wetlands. It is considered native here. Sapporo is on the southwest coast of Hokkaido and is the fourth largest city in Japan. Ever since the 1972 Winter Olympics, it has been famous for its winter sports, but it has recently become a huge magnet for Chinese shoppers who find the prices lower and the quality higher than at home. Sapporo lies at 43.06 degrees north, which is slightly south of Barrington, Nova Scotia, and equal to Portsmouth, New Hampshire on the New England coast, just south of Maine. It is also the same latitude as Niagara Falls in Ontario. Sapporo's monthly temperature has a high of 26 in the summer months, similar to Portsmouth, which is considerably warmer than Nova Scotia. The winters, on the other hand, are similar to Nova Scotia and colder than Portsmouth, but all 12 average monthly temperatures are almost identical to Niagara Falls. The annual precipitation levels are much wetter than Niagara, however, and very similar to Yarmouth. However, the variance in the monthly precipitation levels are the direct opposite to Nova Scotia, highest July to September and lowest in the winter, unlike anywhere on the East Coast, barring hurricane years. Until recently, Hokkaido was largely populated by the native Ainu, who were decimated by Japanese settlement in the mid-1800s, very similar to how settlement affected the Native Americans in North America. I did visit an interesting museum in Sapporo about the native Ainu people, but in general, I did not find them well represented. In and about Sapporo, I saw some more introduced plants that I was familiar with from Canada. New England aster is fairly common. I also found white snakeroot a few times. Our native goldenrods have made big incursions into Japan as elsewhere in the world. The most common was tall goldenrod, Solidago altissima, identifiable by the hairs on the underside of the leaves as well as the entire stem. I did see some giant goldenrod, Solidago gigantea, as well, which is entirely devoid of hairs. I did not see any of the Canada goldenrod, Solidago canadensis, that is so common in Nova Scotia. It has hairs just in the midribs of the leaves, but all three are closely related and very similar. Giant goldenrod is found in Nova Scotia, but tall goldenrod doesn't make it this far east. I was only able to get out of the city once on a bus tour to the mountainous Shakotan Peninsula, about 40 kilometers outside of Sapporo. Our first stop was at the Space Museum outside a small town. This is giant goldenrod in the foreground. Nearby, I found Sakhalin knotweed, identifiable by its leaves much larger than Japanese knotweed, plus oriental bittersweet and giant butterbur. All three of these species are native to Japan and introduced or invasive in Nova Scotia. And Sakhalin knotweed I've noticed particularly in the valley. And it's, like I said, it has a much larger leaf. I also found Japanese mugwort and two more of our native plants, daisy fleabane and a sorry-looking evening primrose. At the next stop, there were acres of silvergrass and other native plants, Siberian yarrow, Aster microcephalus, Asian poison ivy, and pearly everlasting, which is considered native both here and in Japan. Regarding the aster, this is a true aster, unlike the North American Symphotrichums. I found that many Asian plants do not seem to have English common names, too. During lunch, I wandered off through a small forest of Daimo oak. The understory was completely dominated by broadleaf bamboo, though some Japanese knotweed did manage to poke through in places. I've been unable to find a way to identify which species of bamboo I was seeing, but I'm confident it's the genus Sasa. With the bamboo so completely dominating, I wondered how the trees were able to get a foothold to regenerate. My search online told me that there are periodic flowerings followed by mass die-offs of the bamboo, which then allows other plants to establish before the bamboo can regenerate itself from seed. The trees often have a heavy mass seeding coinciding with these die-offs. I then stumbled upon an isolated cemetery. Many of the surrounding trees were covered by kudzu vine. I saw this in many places throughout Japan. On the ground, there were garlic chives and kneeling angelica, and at the edges, the spikenard Aralia cordata and several Korean mulberry trees. As I made my way back to the bus, I saw what I thought was a maple, but it turned out to be Castor aralia, a small tree related to spikenard. I also saw Manchurian ash, Japanese walnut, Amur vetch, and the Asian Gelder rose. This viburnum is very similar to our high bush cranberry. We continued along the coast to a headland with more silvergrass and stunted mono maples, and hillsides full of broadleaf bamboo. The bamboo growing in this more open exposed area seemed to be less dense than I saw in the forest, and growing amongst it was the native Thunberg's geranium, lesser meadow rue, Solidago decurrens, which is a native goldenrod, and what appears to be creeping bellflower. This one I'm unsure because it doesn't look much like the creeping bellflowers I've seen in Canada, but it is the only campanule I can see listed, an inat in Hokkaido, that comes close. This species is not native to Japan. In general, I was just surprised to find out that Japan in the fall was less colorful than I had expected. There was some color from Chinese sumac and the odd Japanese maple, but many of the trees seem to be turning brown and losing their leaves a few at a time, like I've seen in Europe. It made me appreciate how special the fall color that we get here is. So I can't say that this has been a definitive presentation of how the species that grow so invasively outside of Japan fit into their local ecology, but my take was that they are equally aggressive here. It is just that they find a balance with each other. Their individual niches look to be mostly defined by variances in soil and moisture. One species, like Japanese knotweed, may cover a drier outcrop or recently disturbed area. On a wetter site, it might be the Sakhalin knotweed. In more shaded areas, the broadleaf bamboo quickly dominates, but at the edges of the forest, kudzu covers great swaths of trees.
Buzz, I saw your message earlier today. I'm
Mhm.
gonna
In
Yeah.
open fields, you see mile after mile of Chinese silver grass with reed grass in the wetter areas. I suspect the plants in Japan don't have quite the vigor that these plants achieve in North America because of greater ecological pressures, but
Okay.
I'm surprised by how dominant they were even in their native habitat.
All right.
I
Okay.
felt
Talk to
that
you.
there was often less diversity of species than we see in our similar wild, semi-wild areas, but I didn't cover enough ground to say for sure that this is the case. And in particular, I hardly ever saw a sedge. So this has been my first impression of what I was able to see in just a day's worth of travel. Certainly an island of this size has much more to offer, but this trip satisfied a little bit of my curiosity as to what things look like in a place of similar latitude and climate to Nova Scotia, but half a world away.